The bottom line here is that we've got, over 100 million workers across the country that lack actual protections on the books for a national OSHA heat standard. And as Travis mentioned, there is this sort of concept of a general duty to protect this under federal law, but it really doesn't have much teeth. And
thinking of this from an employer side, it's to their advantage to have this in place as well. Because first off, you want to have some very clear information for employers about the nature of the problem, about what can be done about it. All of those things, help an employer know what they need to do to protect workers against the hazard. But beyond that, looking at things like the cost of workers' compensation claims, the cost of having workers out of work. It actually is a pricey problem for workplaces, and employers should be looking to have these kinds of things in place that save them money as well.
All right, welcome to today's podcast. The Heat is On, brought to you by the Labor Health and Safety Fund of North America. Today, we're going to discuss heat-related illness and injuries for occupational health and safety, and just heat in general, and talk about the health hazard on the job. Thanks for taking the time today to join us. Let's go ahead and just get started. Today, I'm fortunate to be joined by Juley Fulcher and Jason Yarashes, and I'll have them introduce themselves. I'll put a slide up here with their names and their titles. First, I'd like to introduce Juley Fulcher. She is a worker health and safety advocate for the public citizen and is in charge of the Congress Watch Division. Juley, would you like to say a little bit about yourself?
Sure. I have been working on public policy issues for about 30 years now. And I come at this from a perspective of how we create better policy around heat and heat stress and the worker dangers that exist. Obviously, I look at it in the broader context of other ways that workers are in danger of health and safety issues at work. But heat is a big aspect of what I look at and where my expertise lies.
Thank you, Juley. And next up is Jason Yarashes. Jason is the lead attorney and program coordinator for the Virginia Justice Project, and he focuses a lot on farm and immigrant workers working outdoors, I think. Jason, would you like to say something about yourself?
Yeah, thanks, y'all. Thanks, Travis. Good to be here with you and Juley. So again, Jason Yarashes with the Legal Aid Justice Center. Our organization has a variety of programs. We push back against the institutions that keep people in poverty and impoverished. So specifically, our worker justice program works with low-income, vulnerable workers who are facing a variety of problems in the workplace. Including things like health and safety, and heat stress is one of the things that is brought to the forefront on a regular basis by workers across the state of Virginia. And so we use all the tools in the toolbox to be able to do advocacy, including but not limited to litigation, community organizing, policy work, media, et cetera. So happy to be on today.
All right, thank you, Jason and Juley. And I'm going to jump right in here and give you a little bit of an introduction to what we're going to talk about today, and then we'll do a question and answer format like a panel. So today, as I said earlier, we're going to discuss heat-related illness and injury. Whether you know or not, millions of U.S. workers are exposed to heat in their workplaces every day. Although illness from exposure to heat is preventable every year, unfortunately, thousands become sick of occupational heat exposure, and in some cases, they unfortunately have fatalities. Dozens of workers die and thousands of workers become ill. There are a range of heat illnesses that can affect anyone, regardless of age or physical condition. Additionally, rising temperatures don't just threaten worker health, they can also decrease productivity on our job sites. And we always want to do worker health and safety and productivity in hand in hand. Heat has always been an occupational hazard, but recent data has shown that global temperatures are rising. As a matter of fact, 19 of the warmest years on record have occurred since the year 2000. And in 2020, this past year, or 2 years ago almost, was tied with 2016 for the warmest year on record. Furthermore, according to the National Weather Service, and I'll throw this chart up here, this is a really compelling chart for me to look at here. According to the National Weather Service, heat is the #1 weather-related killer in the United States, and that includes both occupational and just working in your yard or working at home or working on the road, whatever. So this is all encompassing, not just at work. But look at the slide, we worry about hurricanes, we worry about floods, lightning strikes. Heat is by far the #1 weather-related killer, as you can see on this chart. And it is also, I need to point out that we're going to talk a lot about occupational heat exposure. It is the employer's responsibility to protect workers on the job. Through the OSHA law or the OSH Act, employers are responsible for providing workplaces free of known safety hazard. And this includes protecting workers from extreme heat conditions. An employer with the workers exposed to high temperatures and heat should establish a complete heat illness prevention program. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing my slides and jump into the questions. Now, the first question I'm going to tee up for Jason here. Jason, how important do you think it is that we protect workers from heat-related illness on the job?
Well, the short answer is very, very important. But the longer answer, and again, I'll defer to Juley on specifics here as we go along, as well as you, Travis. But look, I mean, the bottom line here is that we've got, over 100 million workers across the country that lack actual protections on the books for a national OSHA heat standard. And as Travis mentioned, there is this sort of concept of a general duty to protect this under federal law, but it really doesn't have much teeth. And we can talk about that a little more later. But we've got workers laboring both under heat stress conditions, both indoors and outdoors, folks, all the way from farms, construction, warehouses, manufacturing, and sort of all across the board. They've got acute risks for death and illness. And we also know, and Juley, again, is more of the expert on this, but the reported data, while already super troubling, we think vastly underestimates the scope of this problem. And without protections on the books, not just recommendations, but actual legal protections, workers really have no recourse. Just on sort of the importance level, and as we're thinking about this thing from a reasonableness standpoint, there's sort of always tensions going back millennia between labor and business as to what should and shouldn't be on the books, and what's reasonable. And we have many debates about wages, improved housing, things like that. But when I look at an issue like heat stress, this is one that hits people in a very, they should feel it in a really direct way. Anybody who's just been out in the August heat and mowed their lawn or worked in the garden for an hour in the blistering, August heat should know how difficult that is to do. And you multiply that by 12 with no breaks for folks. How do we get folks to empathize with that? And when I tell people just on a regular basis, there really aren't any protections on the books for when folks are doing that. There's no required breaks. There's no water. People are pretty shocked. So these things are important. We need to find a holistic way to address them.
Yes, and that, I think Jason's speaking from Virginia specific, but there are some regs in California and other states across country, but we do not have a federal regulation right now. Juley, do you have anything to add on how important it is that we protect workers from heat-related illness?
Well, I will just, say that thinking of this from an employer side, it's to their advantage to have this in place as well. Because first off, you want to have some very clear information for employers about the nature of the problem, about what can be done about it, when you need to address the heat issue. All of those things, help an employer know what they need to do to protect workers against the hazard. But beyond that, looking at things like the cost of workers' compensation claims, the cost of having workers out of work for, days, the cost to having to replace workers who become temporarily, permanently disabled by heat illness or injury. It actually is a pricey problem for workplaces, and employers should be looking to have these kinds of things in place that save them money as well.
Yeah, I like how you looked at the other side of that coin and looked at the bottom line there. So that was nice. The business case, they call it, for worker protections. Thank you for that. Just digging into this question a little deeper, and either one can jump in here. I'm going to ask a couple questions at once. Do you think this is a priority for workers? And what type of workers does this affect the most? Is there certain occupations that have it worse than others? Indoors, outdoors, stuff like that? Either one can jump in.
I'm happy to start off.
Go ahead.
No, go ahead, please.
I'll start off with some of the, who's most at risk. There's no, surprised that we talk about agriculture workers and construction workers, and add to that anybody who's out there working, road workers, day laborers. Think of it within sort of context. Even within construction workers, you have roofers who are 7 times more likely to get a heat illness than other construction workers. But you also need to look at things from an indoor perspective. Any kind of heat generating machinery or just really poor ventilation indoors can lead to high heat as well. And so you have everything from bakers and people who work in commercial kitchens and industrial laundries to things like steel mills. So it is a big problem for a lot of folks year round. And it's, of course, horrible for a lot of outdoor folks, especially in the summer.
Thank you. Jason?
Yeah, happy to add just a little bit in terms of the priorities. So, our team spends a lot of time on the ground in the communities, at migrant labor camps, at Hispanic tiendas, at churches, just talking to folks about problems in the workplace. And I've been doing it for a half decade. My team's been doing it for quite some time. And over and over and over again, folks just say, we want safety. We want protections from the heat. We want breaks. We want rest. And so by and far away, in terms of what I hear in the field, this is one of the biggest, if not the biggest issues. And really it's framed not just as a legal issue, but as a broader human rights issue, right? When we're talking about things like water, rest, and shade, to be able to avoid major injuries and death, people look at these as common sense, basic human rights needs. So for worker priorities, at least the folks that I talk to in my team, that's across Virginia, and I think nationwide, this is priority number one.
Yeah, thank you very much. Very good answers from both of you. This next question is going to go to Juley first, and then I'll have Jason follow up if he wants to. Let's talk about a little bit more of the details of heat illness and heat injury. What would you call the risk factors for workers exposed to excessive heat?
Well, there are a lot of different things that are going to be extra risky for workers. You have to think about what heat illness is. You've got all these systems in your body that are there to cool you down whenever you get overheated. The problem is that when you're in high heat and your body is also doing a lot of work, your systems can't keep up. They can't keep you cooled. And the worse it gets, the more your illness is going to progress. So it'll start out simple with things like, feeling a little dizzy, a little bit of difficulty with cognition, some dexterity, muscle fatigue kinds of things hit you. You can, we've all felt this on a really hot day. But then it progresses to things like muscle cramps and fainting, and then can go beyond to where you actually see organs starting to shut down, and you can end up with a heat stroke and death. So you think about all the things that are going to affect your body system and ability to cool down. You've got things like what medications you're on, or whether you drank alcohol last night, or what kinds of pesticides you're working around if you're in agriculture. You've got other things like dehydration that are going to make everything worse. Everything that's going on in your body that having difficulty cooling down. If you don't have that cool water to help cool you from the inside, as well as hydrate you and help protect you, you can get into big trouble early and also lead to long-term damage to your body. You've got other issues that you have to deal with, probably the biggest being trying to acclimatization yourself, get used to the work so that your body is stronger in the sense of better able to cool itself down. Your systems to cool down are much better. And we have to really think about also some things about the worker themselves. If you are older, if you are overweight, if you have certain kinds of chronic diseases, heart disease, asthma, any kind of kidney problem, kidney dysfunction, all of those things are going to make it not only harder for you to cool down, but are going to have a much bigger impact on you when it comes, to how the heat impacts your body, and will get you in a situation very quickly where you overheat and where you may end up worsening your already existing problem.
Thank you very much. And I hope you see the chart up here where a lot of things that Julie just talked about, so you can have a pictorial representation of those things. And Jason, would you like to add anything?
I won't add anything from the risk factor standpoint, but just a quick story as to how some of this stuff can play out. A couple of years ago, went out and heard a story from an agricultural worker and several other folks. There was the worker was out in the fields working in high heat and asked the supervisor for a break. The supervisor refused. And the worker, because of the production standards and the fact that everybody else was being pushed, they felt the pressure to continue working. This was early in the season. As Julie said, they probably weren't being properly acclimatized. They fainted, and the supervisor was reluctant to even take them to the hospital in that circumstance. And when the other workers finally convinced the supervisor to do so, this person, the supervisor, was placing blame and mocking the worker and said things like, if you have a problem with this, then there's thousands of workers lined up to take these jobs right behind you. So this intense pressure is difficult enough, even with legal protections. And without having legal protections on the books, workers are just scared to be able to, raise up their concerns. And so this is why it's so important to have legally enforceable standards on the books.
Yeah, very, very good answers. And I want to add a little bit here too. There are different types of heat illness, from, as simple as a heat rash, that's less severe, all the way to often and sometimes fatal heat stroke. And you can see up on the screen here the different types of heat illness. Sometimes they call it heat rash, prickly heat. Everybody's experienced some type of heat exhaustion in their lifetime. Everybody's probably had some cramps, but you usually get to fixing it. But what happens is you get into the heat exhaustion, and then if you get to the heat stroke, it becomes a immediate medical emergency, and that's where the body loses its ability to cool itself, and that's when you leads to fatalities. So I just want to point out the different types of illnesses there. And I'll jump into the next question here. I'm going to tee this one up for Jason. You're going to go first, and I'll have Julie follow. We've kind of already led to this a little bit, but we're going to dig in it here. Has there been any action on the federal level to address heat stress concerns? If not, what can individual states do? Like, for example, certain states have OSHA programs, like in Virginia, that Jason works in Virginia, and I work in Virginia, and I work all over the country. So what's going on at the federal level, and what can we do at the individual states without a federal rule?
Well, thanks, Travis. And Julie, of course, feel free to follow up and let me know if there's been anything you need to correct that I say, or any more recent action, because you're really involved in this so much on the day-to-day with y'all's great work at Public Citizen. So on a general level, as I think we've mentioned, OSHA does not have a specific standard that covers working in hot environments. There has been some recent acts put forth for consideration from Congress, including folks at Public Citizen who have long advocated for these national heat stress standards. And I'll let Julie get into that a little bit later on. So there are some pending bills that are being considered, but still nothing on the book specifically related to heat stress. States can step up, though, as Travis noted, to the extent that there are state plan states. There are several states that have stepped up to the plate, including Washington, California, and Minnesota, that have rules on the books that address safety for workers toiling in these record heats that Travis spoke about. And then very recently, and sadly, tragically, due to a worker death out in Oregon, there was some emergency rules that went into place out there. So these developments are excellent, but again, I just listed only 4 states out of a whole country that have been able to do this.
I did want to add that with respect to the 4 states now who have something in place, Minnesota only covers indoor heat stress. So they don't have anything in place to address these horrible heat waves that we've got going on. Washington's was not, it's never been that protective. And they actually issued, an emergency rule that is more protective because they realized they didn't have enough in place. And we're still trying to make California stronger as well. So what we've got out there, great to have, still not what we need to be most protective of workers.
Right. Thank you very much for those very detailed answers. And let's go further here. So whether it's a federal standard or a state-driven standard, what type of protections should be in these laws? Jason or Julie could go.
I'm happy to give a very general level, and then Julie's much better digging into the specifics if you want to go like that, Julie. So, I mean, big picture here, substantively, we're talking about, as we noted, really common sense protections, things like required rest periods, water breaks, shade, acclimatization, designated people in the workplace to monitor exposures, protective equipment, hazard notifications, record keeping, et cetera. And then you want, as Julie noted, it's one thing to have enforceable, and it's another thing to actually have good standards and enough coverage for people and actually ways to enforce it. So not only does it have to be on the books, but it has to have as much teeth as possible. You need fair, but also real penalties, so employers don't feel as though they can just skirt the laws and pay a small penalty. You need whistleblower protections for folks who speak up to be able to protect it to do so. And then you need ways for folks to, comply. You need the ability for folks to be able to bring workers to bring cases in court if their rights are not being rectified when the government is in charge of the investigation. So that's kind of an overview. Julie, I don't know if you want to dig in on some specifics there.
One thing I will say is, specifics are what's going to be most helpful, both to the worker and to the employer. And the National Institute of Occupational Safety and Health, we call it NIOSH for short, is a part of the CDC, is part of the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. And their whole job is to research different kinds of worker health issues, safety issues, and to look at what the best solutions would be. They have very extensive guidance about what should be in a protective worker standard. And when I say very specific, they actually lay out charts about, when it's this hot out, you should be getting this many breaks and, drinking this much water and all of those things. So things like that exist that are very specific. And it's not as hard as you think, because NIOSH and OSHA have actually put together a smartphone app where it literally, like it looks at where you are and it calculates the heat index, and then it lays out what the various precautions are that are necessary at that point. So there are things out there that could be made very clear so that workplaces can understand and do this easily. And a big part of it is requiring workplaces as well to have a plan, to really lay out, okay, under the statute, here's what's required, or under the standard, here's what's required. Okay, here's how my workplace is going to best adapt to those requirements, and have everything in place so that our workers are trained and trained often. We have our systems in place. Not just sometimes having one person who's in charge of monitoring heat, but having buddy systems and training everybody to look after each other, because we often don't recognize the early signs of heat illness in ourselves, but we might be able to see it in someone else and intervene early. And then, as you said, having emergency systems in place and having employers understand, when in doubt, call 911. This whole sort of what we've been seeing of employers trying to prolong that effort and not really recognizing that this could be a potentially fatal issue. And ultimately, an emergency occurs that didn't need to, because they didn't get help soon enough. So having all of those details out there are going to be critical for everyone involved.
Yeah, and I'm really glad you brought up the heat index, because that's very important to understand when it comes to worker protections on the job, and how to recognize signs and symptoms, how to react for employers and employees. And also you brought up training, which is of the utmost importance. We always got to train our workers. So along those lines, and talking about the heat index, and how hot is too hot?
That's a very good question. And the problem is there isn't an easy cutoff. You can't say, this temperature is not too hot and this temperature is too hot. We certainly have some general categories that we use. And we work off of the heat index, as you said, because it's not just the temperature, it's the humidity. There's actually other factors as well that we like to involve into a more sophisticated measure, which is the wet globe bulb temperature, but that's usually more sophisticated than most employers are in a position to calculate. And so we like to rely on the heat index. But part of the problem is it's not just the heat that's outside that's heating up your body. It's what's being generated in your body by the type of work you're doing. So the heavier your workload, if you're doing a lot of bending and lifting of heavy things and walking long distance and moving at high speeds, all of those things are heating up your body as well. So you have to look at both the workload, along with the heat index to figure out when things are going to need additional protections and when they reach a sort of unworkable condition. In general, we say that once the heat index gets above 115, it's probably an unworkable, condition for just about every type of work that you're doing. It's a very dangerous time to be outside. And so we want people to cut it off. Does that mean that 114 is not that at that level? No, not necessarily. It's just kind of an arbitrary number. But, understanding that even if it's 75 or 80 degrees heat index out there, if you're doing really heavy duty work and you're not taking breaks and not getting adequately hydrated, you can end up getting heat illness. And it's also really important to understand that if you live in Southern Florida and you've lived there all your life, then 90 degrees is different for you than it is for somebody who lives in Maine or Rhode Island, where that's a very high temperature. They're not used to it. Their body's not used to it. So there are a lot of things we have to take into account. It's really hard to make those clear categories, but as the slide indicates, there's some generalizations that we can make.
Yeah, thank you very much. Like you said, there's a lot of science in here and a lot of individual traits of workers and humidity and heat. And that's what they call the heat index, is you add them all together to get a risk factor for workers. Jason, would you have anything to add there?
No, I'm not the science person on the call, but I will, just hearing this from a lay standpoint, it just makes me nervous even thinking about anybody being out in those heat conditions, much less being out working in those harsh conditions. And we hear from folks day in, day out. They want to work hard and provide for their families, but at the same time, they want to be safe. And these numbers are just, shocking to anyone.
Yeah, I agree with you. One thing to understand, the heat index is it's additional. So you get the actual ambient temperature, then you add in the relative humidity, and then you add these factors like how hard are you working? Are you working in direct sunlight? How much PPE you have on? Or do you have heavy clothing on? All that, and that adds into that number. So the number might seem a little high to you. It's not just the temperature. So, but here's I'm toggling back and forth here. Here's what the recommended things are for employers when you get to these heat indexes. So you can have that there. I had it up there while Julie was talking. Okay, we mentioned this. I'd like to dive in a little deeper with acclimatization. How important is it, and what is it, Julie?
Well, as I said, your body has these systems in place that are there to cool you off. Those systems get stronger if we are used to heat and we're used to needing to cool ourselves off. It's like exercise or something like that. The more you do, the better your body is able to deal with things. So if you work in high heat a lot, if you do heavy work in high heat a lot, your body is going to be better acclimatized to high heat than someone who has never worked in high heat or has never done that kind of work in high heat. And in fact, when we look at fatalities that result from high heat, we find that the biggest portion of those happen in the first 3 to 5 days that someone's on a job. And it's because you're diving right in, you're not used to it, and your body can't handle it. The way we acclimatize you is we gradually build up your time doing the job. So, on the first day, you may work 3 hours. On the second day, we may have you work, 6 hours. The third day, we may have you work, 8, 9, whatever your schedule is. Sometimes we even make that a slower build up, especially depending on how much heat you're working in and how much you're doing. But it's a really critical thing to do to get someone's body in that position where they can handle it. And it's also important to note it's not just the first day that you're on a job. If you take 2 weeks off and go for, a vacation, a skiing vacation somewhere in the cold weather, and you come back, we've got to acclimatize you all over again. Or if you're out with an injury of some kind, same thing. And so really critical to understand that need, to address it, and to make sure that your employees are at the best condition they can be. It doesn't mean you're acclimatized and you're safe. We've still got all of these things that can happen to you. Your body systems are still not going to be able to cool you down when it gets hot enough. But the better shape you're in acclimatization wise, the safer you will be.
Yeah, thank you very much. Very good points there, Julie. Jason, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, the only thing that I'll note is that this is very real. You see a lot of employers saying that they're already doing this, and that may well be true. But we talk to thousands of workers a year, and they're just take the example of folks that are coming in on short 4 to 6 week, agricultural migrant labor contracts. They're thrown right into it. And so for a lot of folks that are saying that they're already doing this, I can tell you from firsthand experience with talking to folks out in the field that is not happening. So all the more reason to have actual standards on the books. So employers say, if they are doing it, all right, then there's a check in place to show that they are.
Yeah, thank you very much. And the last thing I would like to ask some questions about and discuss, and then we'll be done, is personal protective equipment. Most of our workers, our bread and butter is construction work. We also do heavy highway. We're out on the road work. I mean, laborers are very, very diverse. We do all types of work, but we're heavy in construction. So there's a lot of PPE or personal protective equipment that inherently we got to wear on our job sites. How can that contribute to the overall heat load on a worker? And are there some things that we can do? Some of it might even be positive for heat illness or stress, but what about PPE?
Well, PPE has all different kinds of impacts depending on what it is. Obviously, if you're carrying extra weight, that's increasing your workload. It's more for your body to have to deal with, and so will cause problems. One of the ways that our body it protects us from heat and helps us keep cool is by vasodilation. Essentially, the blood is coming to the surface of our skin so that it can be cooled by the air around it. Well, if you're wearing a lot of clothing, or you're wearing, vests and other things like that, it's going to keep more of that heat inside. You're not really going to be able to release that heat the same way you might if you were wearing very light clothing. Also the materials that it's made out of in terms of breathability can cause a real problem. There are other things that have always been an issue in construction where you have to wear respirators, but some of those who aren't used to wearing masks that we had to add on during COVID. It's also problematic in terms of heat because another way that we cool ourselves down is by bringing as much cool air as we can into our lungs to help, cool us internally. And having that mask on makes it more difficult for you to get the cool air in and get the hot air out. That's not to say you don't wear the mask when needed to protect you from COVID. It's just one more thing that we have to consider in figuring out, when you're getting too hot, when you're overheating, when you need breaks. It also made it very interesting because you couldn't just take a break right close to other people. You couldn't all sort of cram together into one little break area. And what's more, we wanted you to be able to have what we were calling mask breaks, right? You have to have the opportunity to take off that mask to cool yourself down. That has to be part of the break. With COVID, that was, you couldn't really take the mask off if you were going to be around other people. Now, obviously, when you're in a situation where you're using respirators and the like, you're better able to do that. But it does mean also you need to take your break away from the work site where dangers like that require the respirator exist, so that you can take that mask off. That said, I will also add that there are kinds of personal protective equipment that now exist that help with cooling. There are cooling vests that are water-filled vests that help us stay cool, and other kinds of things that exist and are constantly being manufactured as well. There's a lot of folks in that sort of scientific side of things trying to create better and better PPE that will be helpful. There are trade-offs. Cooling vest is heavy, so you've got to sort of balance what's there. And certainly there's nothing out there that's going to protect you entirely from heat. You're always going to have the rest breaks, the adequate hydration, etc.
Yeah, thank you very much. Jason, you have anything to add on personal protective equipment?
Oh, nothing to add. Always excited to learn more from Juley and others.
All right. All right. And what I'll do now is we're about to finish up, but I want to give each of you an opportunity for maybe a last word. Jason, you can go first.
Sure. So just, we've talked about the protections that we need. We've talked about, the importance of them. And so just a brief note on the strategies that advocates and communities can use to convince decision makers to push for these laws, right? As Juley noted and Travis reiterated, this should be an across the aisle, across the business labor spectrum, right? We're talking about protecting workers, protecting health, and protecting businesses. And so there's, a lot of strategies that you can use to put together. You have to have, all of these things, good relationships with legislators and decision makers. You have to have diverse groups of advocates, from doctors and lawyers and community organizers, public health, unions, national organizations like Public Citizen. You have to have the research, targeted traditional and social media. You have to galvanize faith and student movements, and you have to look to what's going to speak the most to decision makers in your state and locality that may be different from place to place. And then the major point that I really can't emphasize enough, and we saw this big time in Virginia in our General Assembly, is the worker's voice. Because we can sit up there as an advocate, I can talk all day, but when you have a worker, as they did here in Virginia, go up and talk to legislators that has worked in the fields for decades and say what it's like, that is extremely powerful. So for anybody who's doing this work, make sure that you get the workers in front of the decision makers.
Good points, Jason. And Juley?
Well, first of all, as a policy person, I say here to everything that Jason just said. It's so critical that we have the involvement, the action, the passion from as many people as possible on this, because it is not only a critical issue now, but it's getting worse. We are seeing hotter and hotter summers, and that's not going in a nice linear fashion. It's accelerating. And with what we know of climate change, it's going to keep accelerating. So it's going to get fast. It's going to get hotter a lot faster each summer. And so this is going to be a much bigger problem very shortly. And that's true all over the country. Important to note. I also wanted to make a point about heat waves. In the news, we all hear about it. We all see it, horrible things. It's important to know that a heat wave is different from it just being a really hot day. We catch those horrible temperatures, 116 degrees, and you think, oh, well, that's the kind of day that you would have to do X, Y, and Z protection, or actually, cancel work altogether during daylight hours. But it's important to note that it's more than that. As I said, we have, our systems to cool us down. When you work hard all day and your body's working hard all day to cool you down, you get tired. That system gets tired the same way your muscles get tired if you work hard all day. And your body needs the ability to recover. And a lot of times, if you're working, in really high temperatures and hard labor, any time of overnight is difficult to recover and get back out there the next day and work in the same heat. When it's a heat wave, it's much worse, because your systems are really being, pushed to the limits. And, overnight is not going to cool you down completely. So you're going to come into day 2 already at a disadvantage, and you're going to overheat much quicker. And day 3 is worse, and day 4 is worse than that. So even if that hot temperature is consistent every single day of the heat wave, it's getting more and more dangerous every day that you work in it. It's also important to note that in a heat wave, we tend not to get very cool evenings. The coolest part of the 24 hours is typically pretty high. Oftentimes it may not get below 80 degrees. So we're also in a position where we're not really having that opportunity to cool down overnight, especially if you don't have air conditioning or you don't have, any kind of fans or adequate ventilation. That overnight is doing very little for you, making it even more dangerous. So we need to pay attention to heat waves in a different way. The same way we talked about acclimatization. Well, you're not acclimatized to work in heat conditions that are 30 degrees over what are typical work days for you, even summer work days for you. And I will also add to that, a heat wave is a problem wherever you are. If you're working in temperatures that are 20 or 30 degrees over what is normal for your area, it's a problem. We paid a lot of attention to the Pacific Northwest because it was horrible what was going on out there. But we also had a heat wave that was going on through New England. And we were having real problems in Maine, Rhode Island, these areas, even though their temperatures were only in the 90s. These were temperatures much higher than people were used to working in. And people in those areas tend not to have air conditioning the same way they do in other parts of the country. So it's really important for workers and employers to understand that a heat wave is different than just working on a very hot day when it comes to thinking through all of these ways that we protect workers. I mentioned climate change. Part of it is that we are seeing more heat waves each year. We are seeing longer heat waves. They are hotter or more intense heat waves. And the season for heat waves is getting longer. It's not just June, July, August. It's, May through September. And all of that is going to keep getting worse as well. So, the heat, the everyday heat, you got to be prepared for it. It's a problem. The heat waves, really deadly.
Yeah.
Sorry to end on that horrible note.
No problem. So thank you very much, both of you, for your time today. Your comments and answers to questions were very insightful and educational. I liked how we really dove into the science of things too and got detailed into the weeds here a little bit. So thank you. And before I share some resources, I'd like to thank Jason and Juley for the time today. I'd like to thank the participants on this podcast for listening to us today on this very important topic. And now I'm going to share some resources with you. At the Health and Safety Fund, we do have a very successful SunSense Plus program that's been in effect for several years, and it seems to get more popular every year. It's all about skin cancer prevention, but we also talk about the occupational end of things, which we've done today. We have a bunch of different toolbox talks. Juley talked about the NIOSH OSHA Heat Safety Tool app. I suggest as an employer, you go ahead and download that. As an employee, go ahead and download it. It's free. It's a very resourceful tool. If you want something to go on, it's also got some stuff on there that you could use for training of workers, signs and symptoms. It's a really well done app and a really good tool. So there's some resources there. My contact is here. I'll leave that up there for just a couple seconds here at the end, so you can write that down, and just do not hesitate to contact me if you have any questions or concerns about heat illness and injuries or anything involving occupational safety and health. And with that, thank you very much.